clean copy of the tape here now, and, well, look, I should warn you that this could really scare you. This is the letter I received from one of it's dated the 6th of June, 2006. I've recently started. You'll believe it when you talked about the sounds from hell tonight. My uncle had told me this story a couple of years ago, and I didn't believe him. Like, discounted the story as nothing more than just a hysterical religious newspaper account. The story about the digging of the hole and the hearing of the sounds from hell is very real. It did occur in Siberia on a regular mining expedition exploring future oil reserves. My uncle collected videos and audio tapes and so forth on the paranormal and supernatural until he passed away recently under strange and terrible circumstances. He let me listen to one of the audio tapes that he had on the sounds from hell in Siberia, and I copied it. He received his version from a close friend who worked for the BBC in London. It took me a while to find it tonight, but attached is that sound from my uncle's tapes. It's not the greatest quality, but the sounds, those horrible sounds are there. I was very hesitant to send you this, as the noise bothers me to listen to. It has always haunted me. To those who discounted the Siberian sounds from hell story, it is true, and I, for one, wish it wasn't. Well, that's the letter, and this is the tape. It's a clean, better copy, and I will warn you that what you are about to hear is very, very disturbing indeed.
Welcome, guys, to Pony Me Bro presents Strange Stories, spoopy tales that go bump in the night. This sort of started because I realized that I wasn't reading as often as I wanted to, and found that if I started reading out loud to Mrs. Bro and Little Bro, that I actually wound up reading. And one of the things sitting on my shelf for a while was the collected fantasies of Clark Ashton Smith, who, if you don't know, was sort of the literary mentor to H.P. Lovecraft. He was very influential to the latter writer. They exchanged a lot of letters back and forth. They helped build shared mythologies and things like that. H.P. Lovecraft, obviously a lot more famous, but Clark Ashton Smith, actually, arguably the superior writer. That's neither here nor there. He did write some good stuff, and so I thought, I've been wanting to do some comfy streams for a while. I don't really play video games, aside from testing for MLP mostly, and my internet is pretty potato. It's not nearly fast enough to stream some like actual video consistently, but the audio does okay. So I thought I would read some stories for anybody that wanted to hear them. So what we're going to do is I will read a selection of stuff that I wanted to hit, and then if we have time, I'll give you guys some options from the same series, and you can pick a title that sounds particularly tantalizing. If I could read this in the voice of someone like Doug Bradley, who you may recognize from the intro I played, or as Pinhead from Hellraiser, or Christopher Lee, I would. I'm not so gifted, but we will nevertheless persevere. So we'll just get right into it, because I know it's a Sunday, and most people, if you're in America, want to go to bed and go to work in the morning. If you're in Europe and you're still awake, we could take all night. Sort of in the tradition of the ancient Greeks, a lot of stories start out with sort of an ode to the muses. Smith suitably wrote one to the demon. So we'll start with that, and then we'll switch to the first of the stories. So, to the demon. Tell me... Oh, let's start some ambient music, actually. So in the background, we will softly be playing some Bach. I don't know if any of you saw the story of a professor recorded every single organ work written by Johann Sebastian Bach, recorded them, and the university released them for free download. It's hours and hours and hours and hours of music, and it's really good, so it's going to make excellent background music. I wouldn't call it comfy so much as disconcerting, but considering the subject matter, that's going to work out, I think, for us just fine. There we go. Tell me tales, O benign, maleficent demon, but tell me none that I have ever heard or have even dreamt of otherwise than obscurely or infrequently. Nay, tell me not of anything that lies between the bournes of time or the limits of space, for I am a little weary of all recorded years and charted lands, and the isles that are westward of Cathay and the sunset realms of Ind are not remote enough to be made the abiding place of my conceptions, and Atlantis is over new for my thoughts to sojourn there, and Mu itself has gazed upon the sun in eons that are too recent. Tell me many tales, but let them be of things that are past the lore of legend, and of which there are no myths in our world or any world adjoining. Tell me, if you will, of the years when the moon was young, with siren-rippled seas and mountains that were zoned with flowers from base to summit. Tell me of the planets gray with eld, of the worlds whereon no mortal astronomer has ever looked, and whose mystic heavens and horizons have given pause to visionaries. Tell me of the vaster blossoms within whose cradling chalices a woman could sleep, of the seas of fire that beat on strands of ever-during ice, of perfumes that can give eternal slumber in a breath, of eyeless titans that dwell in Uranus, and beings that wander in the green light of the twin suns of azure and orange. Tell me tales of inconceivable fear and unimaginable love, in orbs whereto our sun is a nameless star, or unto which its rays have never reached. Spooky! Okay, so the first story we're going to read is my personal favorite of his that I've read so far, A Night in Malnant. It's pretty short, but I think will give you a reasonably good taste of his style and the sort of subject matter that he often sort of dwells on. If you want to liven things up and make a drinking game, you can drink and you can choose your level of intensity. Every time I yawn, I have a really terrible habit of yawning when I read out loud. I will try not to do that. If you want to ramp things up even more, you can drink every time he uses a word that you don't know the meaning of. This happens to me constantly. If I was on my own, I would be stopping and then consulting a dictionary, because he was writing in the 20s and 30s and 40s when people were smarter than they are now. I include myself in that description. Also, when something is casually racist, that's a good drinking opportunity too. I don't know that there's any of that in this particular story, but he does cover some material involving deepest, darkest Africa, which is pretty funny to modern ears. But without further ado, A Night in Malnant. My brief sojourn in the city of Malnant occurred during a period of my life that is dim and dubious, even as that city itself and the misty regions lying thereabouts. I have no precise recollection of its locality, nor can I remember exactly when and how I came to visit it. Oh, sorry, just realized I had a thing for this. There we go. I have no precise recollection of its locality, nor can I remember exactly when and how I came to visit it. But I had heard vaguely that such a place was situated along my route, and when I came to the fog-enfolded river that flows beside its walls and heard beyond the river the mortuary tolling of many bells, I surmised that I was approaching Malnant. On reaching the grey, colossal bridge that crosses the river at that point, I could have continued at will on other roads leading to remoter cities, but it seemed to me that I might as well enter Malnant as any other place. And so it was that I set foot on the bridge of shadowy arches, under which the black waters flowed in stealthy division, and were joined again in a silence as of Styx and Acheron. That period of my life, I have said, was dim and dubious. Mainly so, perhaps on account of my need for forgetfulness, my persistent and at times partially rewarded search for oblivion. And that which I needed to forget above all was the death of the Lady Marielle, and the fact that I myself had slain her as surely as if I had done the deed with my own hand. For she had loved me with an affection that was deeper and purer and more stable than mine, and my changeable temper, my fits of cruel indifference or ferocious irritability, had broken her gentle heart. So it was that she had sought the anodyne of a lethal poison, and after she was laid to rest in the somber vaults of her ancestors, I had become a wanderer, followed and forever tortured by a belated remorse. For months or years, I am uncertain which, I roamed from old world city to city, heeding little where I went, if only wine and the other agents of oblivion were available. And thus it was that I came, some while in my indefinite journeying, to the dim environs of Malnant. The sun, if ever there was a sun above this region, had been lost for I knew not how long in a sky of leaden vapors. The day was drear and sullen at best, but now, by the thickening of the shadows and the mist, I felt that evening must be near, and the bells I had heard in Malneant, however heavy and sepulchral their tolling, gave at least the assurance of prospective shelter from the night. So I crossed the long bridge and entered the grimly yawning gate with a quickening of my footsteps, even if with no alacrity of spirit. The dusk had gathered behind the grey walls, but there were few lights in the city. Also, few people were abroad, and these went upon their way with a sort of solemn haste, as if on some funereal errand that would admit of no delay. The streets were narrow, the houses high, with overhanging balconies and heavily curtained or shuttered windows. All was very silent, except for the bells, which tolled recurrently, sometimes faint and far off, and sometimes with a loud and startling clangor that seemed to come almost from overhead. As I plunged among the shadowy mansions along the streets from which a visible twilight issued to envelop me, it seemed that I was going further and further away from my memories at every step. For this reason, I did not at once inquire my way to a tavern, but was content to lose myself more and more in the grey labyrinth of buildings, which grew vaguer and vaguer amid the ever-mounting darkness and fog, as if they were about to dissolve in oblivion. I think that my soul would have been almost at peace with itself during that first hour in Malneant, if it had not been for the reiterant ringing of the bells, which were like all bells that toll for the repose of the dead, and therefore set me to remembering those that had rung for Mariel. But whenever they ceased, my thoughts would soon drift back with an indolent ease, and a recovered security to the all-surrounding vagueness, and I would walk the length of many dark alleys, past many of the shrouded and mysterious mansions, in whose interior I could somehow imagine nothing but cobwebs and silence and slumber, before the hateful pealing began once more. Also, I deemed that the sound of the bells receded and became fainter with each repetition, and I hoped that I would presently lose it altogether, along with my troublous memories. I had no idea how far I had gone in Malneant, nor how long I had roamed among those houses that hardly seemed as if they could be peopled by any but the sleeping or the dead. At last, however, I became aware that I was very tired, and bethought me of food and wine and a lodging for the night. But nowhere in my wanderings had I noticed the signboard of an inn, so I resolved to ask the next passer-by for the desired direction. As I have said before, there were few people abroad. How few I had apparently not realized, for when I made up my mind to address one of them, it appeared that there was no one at all, and I walked onward through street after street in my futile search for a living face. At length I met two women, clothed in grey that was cold and dim as the folds of the fog, and veiled withal, who were hurrying along the street with the same funereal intentness I had perceived in all other denizens of that city. I made bold to accost them, asking if they could direct me to an inn. Scarcely pausing or even turning their heads, they answered, "We cannot tell you. We are shroud weavers, and we have been busy making a shroud for the Lady Mariel." Now, at that name, which of all names in the world was the one I should least have expected or cared to hear, an unspeakable chill invaded my heart, and I felt a dreadful surprise, a dismay like the breath of the tomb. It was indeed strange that in this dim city, so far in time and space from all I had fled to escape, a woman should have recently died who was also named Mariel. The coincidence appeared so sinister that an odd fear of the streets through which I had wandered was born suddenly in my soul, for the name had evoked with a more irrevocable fatality than the tolling of the bells all that I had vainly wished to forget, and the dying coals of my remorse were fanned to a ravening flame. As I went onward, with paces that had become more hurried, more feverish than those of the people of Malneant, I met two men who were likewise dressed from head to foot in grey, and I asked of them the same question I had asked of the shroud weavers. "We cannot tell you," they replied. "We are coffin makers, and we have been busy making a coffin for the Lady Mariel." As they spoke and hastened on, the bells rang out again, this time very near at hand, with a more leaden and sepulchral menace in their dismal tolling. And everything about me, the tall and misty houses, the dark indefinite streets, the rare and wraith-like figures, became as if part of the obscure confusion and fear and bafflement of a nightmare. Moment by moment the coincidence on which I had stumbled appeared all too bizarre for belief, and I was troubled now by the monstrous and absurd idea that the Mariel I knew had only just died, and that this fantastic city was in some unsurmisable manner connected with her death. But this, of course, my reason rejected summarily, and I kept repeating to myself, the Mariel of whom they speak is another Mariel. And it irritated me beyond all measure that a doubt so enormous and ludicrous should return when my logic had dismissed it. I met no more people of whom to inquire my way, but at length, as I fought with my shadowy perplexity and my burning memories, I found that I had paused almost beneath the weather-beaten sign of an inn, on which the lettering had been half effaced by time and the brown lichens. The building was obviously very old, like all the houses in Malneant. Its upper stories were lost in the swirling fog, except for a few furtive lights that glowed obscurely down, and a vague and musty odor of antiquity came forth to greet me as I mounted the steps and tried to open the ponderous door. But the door had been locked or bolted, so I began to pound upon it with my fists to attract the attention of those within. At length, after much delay, the door was opened slowly and grudgingly, and a cadaverous-looking individual peered forth, frowning with portentous gravity as he saw me. "What do you desire?" he queried in tones that were both brusque and solemn. "A room for the night, and wine," I answered. "We cannot accommodate you. All the rooms are occupied by people who have come to attend the obsequies of the Lady Mariel, and all the wine in the house has been requisitioned for their use. You will have to go elsewhere." He closed the door quickly upon me with the last words. I turned to resume my wanderings, and all that had troubled me before was now intensified 100-fold. The gray mists and the grayer houses were full of the menace of memory. They were like traitorous tombs from which the cadavers of dead hours poured forth to assail me with envenomed fangs and talons. I cursed the hour when I had entered Malneant, for it seemed to me now that in so doing I had merely completed a funereal sinister circle through time, and had returned to the day of Mariel's death. And certainly all my recollections of Mariel, of her final agony and her entombment, had assumed the frightful vitality of present things. But my reason still maintained, of course, that the Mariel who lay dead somewhere in Malneant, and for whom all these obsequial preparations were being made, was not the lady whom I had loved, but another. After threading many streets that were still darker or narrower than those before I traversed, I found a second inn, bearing a similar weather-worn sign, and in all other respects very much like the first. The door was also barred, and I knocked thereon in much trepidation, and was in no manner surprised when a second individual with a cadaverous face informed me in tones of sepulchral solemnity, "We cannot accommodate you. All the rooms have been taken by musicians and mourners, who will serve at the obsequies of the Lady Mariel, and all the wine has been reserved for their use." Now I began to dread the city about me with a manifold fear, for apparently the whole business of the people of Malneant consisted of preparations for the funeral of this Lady Mariel, whether or not she was the same Mariel whom I had known. And it became to be obvious that I must walk the streets of the city all night because of these same preparations. All at once an overwhelming weariness was mingled with my nightmare terror and perplexity. I had not long continued my peregrinations after leaving the second inn, when the bells were tolled once more. For the first time, I found it possible to identify their source. They were in the spires of a great cathedral which loomed immediately before me through the fog. Some people were entering the cathedral, and a curiosity which I knew to be both morbid and perilous prompted me to follow them. Here I somehow felt I should be able to learn more regarding the mystery that tormented me. All was dim within, and the light of many tapers scarcely served to illumine the vast nave and altar. Masses were being said by priests in black, whose faces I could not see distinctly, and to me their chanting was like words in a dream. And I could hear nothing, and nothing was plainly visible in all the place, except a bier of opulent fabrics, on which there lay a motionless form in white. Flowers of many hues had been strewn upon the bier, and their fragrance filled the air with a drowsy languor, with an anodyne that seemed to drug my heart and brain. Such flowers had been cast on the bier of Mariel, and even thus, at her funeral, I had been overcome by a momentary dulling of the senses because of their perfume. I became dimly aware that someone was at my elbow, With eyes still intent on the bier, I asked, "Who is it that lies yonder for whom these masses are being said and these bells are rung?" And a slow, sepulchral voice replied, "It is the Lady Marielle, who died yesterday, and who will be interred tomorrow in the vaults of her ancestors. If you wish, you may go forward and gaze upon her." So I went down the aisle of the cathedral, even to the side of the bier, whose opulent fabrics trailed on the cold flags, and the face of her whom lay thereon with a tranquil smile upon the lips, and tender shadows upon the shut eyelids, was the face of the Marielle I had loved, and of none other. The tides of time were frozen in their flowing, and all that was or had been or could be, all of the world that existed aside from her, became as fading shadows, and even as once before, was it eons or instants ago, my soul was locked in the marble hell of its supreme grief and regret. I could not move, I could not cry out or even weep, for my very tears were turned to ice. And now I knew with a terrible certitude that this one event, the death of the Lady Marielle, had drawn apart from all other happenings, had broken away from the sequence of time, and had found for itself a setting of appropriate gloom and solemnity. Or perhaps it even built around itself the whole enormous maze of that spectral city, in which to abide my destined return among the mists of a deceptive oblivion. At length, with an awful effort of will, I turned my eyes away, and leaving the cathedral with steps that were both hurried and leaden, I sought to find an egress from the dismal labyrinth of Malnéant to the gate by which I had entered. But this was by no means easy, and I must have roamed for hours in alleys blind and stifling as tombs, and along the tortuous, self-reverting thoroughfares, ere I came to a familiar street, and was able henceforward to direct my paces with something of surety. And a dull and sunless daylight was dawning behind the mists when I crossed the bridge and came again to the road that would lead me away from that fatal city. Since then, I've wandered long, and in many places, but never again have I cared to revisit those old-world realms of fog and mist, for fear that I should come once more to Malnéant, and find that its people are still busied with their preparations for the obsequies of the Lady Marielle. Tell me that's not the good shit, right? That is, that's the third time I've read that, and it gives me chills. It really does. He's such a phenomenal writer. He's got a fantastic sense of pacing and building the dread, but if you didn't like that, then this probably isn't going to be for you. I think it's a good litmus test, a good benchmark. The next selection will be The Epiphany of Death. This particular story, he, sort of calling back to the start of the show, he dedicated to H.P. Lovecraft. So I don't know if that'll give you any idea of the tone of the story or not, but we'll jump into it. Give me 1 second. Wait, whiskey and orange juice? Poster fig, please. Tell me it was Jack Daniels or something worthless so you didn't spoil a perfectly good whiskey. Okay. What do we got? Oh, 6 people are listening to this? Rock on, alright. Totes worth it. Okay. Well, they're missing out. If you know somebody that likes spoken word and stuff like that, you can say, hey, there's this thing you can listen to if you don't mind pictures of ponies at the start. Not that this has anything to do with ponies. Maybe it will. Maybe not. Who knows? Okay. The Epiphany of Death, dedicated to H.P. Lovecraft. I find it peculiarly difficult to express the exact nature of this sentiment which Tomaron had always evoked in me. However, I am sure that the feeling never partook at any time of what is ordinarily known as friendship. It was a compound of unusual aesthetic and intellectual elements, and was somehow closely allied in my thoughts with the same fascination that has drawn me ever since childhood toward all things that are remote in space and time, or which have about them the irresolvable twilight of antiquity. Somehow, Tomaron seemed never to belong to the present, but one could readily have imagined him as living in some bygone age. About him there was nothing whatever of the lineaments of our own period, and he even went so far as to affect in his costume an approximation to the garments worn several centuries ago. His complexion was extremely pale and cadaverous, and he stooped heavily from poring over ancient tomes and no less ancient maps. He moved always with the slow, meditative pace of one who dwells among far-off reveries and memories, and he spoke often of people and events and ideas that have long since been forgotten. For the most part, he was apparently unheedful of present things, and I felt that for him the huge city of Ptolemaides, in which we both dwelt, with all its manifold clamor and tumult, was little more than a labyrinth of painted vapors. Oddly enough, there was a like vagueness in the attitude of others towards Tomeron, and though he had always been accepted without question as a representative of the noble and otherwise extinct family from which he claimed descent, nothing appeared to be known about his actual birth and antecedents. With 2 servants, who were both deaf mutes, who were very old and who likewise wore the raiment of a former age, he lived in the semi-ruinous mansion of his ancestors, where, it was said, none of the family had dwelt for many generations. There he pursued the occult and recondite studies that were so congenial to his mind, and there, at certain intervals, I was wont to visit him. I cannot recall the precise date and circumstances of the beginning of my acquaintance with Tomeron. Though I come of a hardy line that is noted for the sanity of its constitution, my faculties had been woefully shaken by the horror of the happening with which that acquaintance ended. My memory is not what it was, and there are certain lacunae for which my readers must contrive to forgive me. The only wonder is that my powers of recollection have survived at all, beneath the hideous burden they have had to bear, for in a more than metaphoric sense, I have been as one condemned to carry with him, at all times and in all places, the loathsome incubus of things long dead and corrupt. I can readily recall, however, the studies to which Tomeron had devoted himself, the lost demonian volumes from Hyperborea and Mu and Atlantis with which his library shelves were heaped to the ceiling, and the queer charts, not of any land that lies above the surface of the earth, on which he pored by perpetual candlelight. I shall not speak of these studies, for they would seem too fantastic and too macabre for credibility, and that which I have to relate is incredible enough in itself. I shall speak, however, of certain strange ideas with which Tomeron was much preoccupied, and concerning which he so often discoursed to me in that deep, guttural, monotonous voice of his, that had the reverberation of unsounded caverns in its tones and cadences. He maintained that life and death were not the fixed conditions that people commonly believed them to be, that the 2 realms were often intermingled in ways not readily discerned, and had penumbral borderlands, that the dead were not always the dead, nor the living, as such terms are habitually understood. But the manner in which he spoke of these ideas was extremely vague and general, and I could not induce him to specify his meaning or to proffer some concrete illustration that would render it intelligible to a mentality such as mine, that was unused to dealing in the cobwebs of abstraction. Behind his words there hovered, or seemed to hover, a legion of dark, amorphous images that I could never formulate or depict to myself in any way, until the final denouement of our descent into the catacombs of Ptolemaides. I have already said that my feeling for Tomeron was never anything that could be classified as friendship, but even from the first, I was well aware that Tomeron had a curious fondness for me, a fondness whose nature I could not comprehend, and with which I could hardly even sympathize. Though he fascinated me at all times, there were occasions when my interest was not unalloyed with an actual sense of repulsion. At whiles his pallor was too cadaverous, too suggestive of fungi that have grown in the dark, or of leprous bones by moonlight, and the stoop of his shoulders conveyed to my brain the idea that they bore a burden of centuries through which no man could conceivably have lived. He aroused always a certain awe in me, and the awe was sometimes mingled with an indeterminate fear. I do not remember how long our acquaintance had continued, but I do remember that he spoke with increasing frequency toward the end of those bizarre ideas at which I have hinted. Also, I felt that he was troubled about something, for he often looked at me with a mournful gleam in his hollow eyes, and sometimes he would speak with peculiar stress of the great regard that he had for me. And one night he said, "Theolus,
The time is coming when you must know the truth. Must know me as I am, and not as I have been permitted to seem. There is a term to all things, and all things are obedient to inexorable laws. I would that it were otherwise, but neither I nor any man, among the living or among the dead, can lengthen at will the term of any state or condition of being, or alter the laws that decree such conditions.
Perhaps it was well that I did not understand him, and that I was unable to attach much importance to his words, or to the singular intentness of his bearing as he uttered them. For a few more days I was spared the knowledge which I now carry. Then one evening Tomaron spoke thus.
I am now compelled to ask an odd favor of you, which I hope you will grant me in consideration of our long friendship. The favor is that you accompany me this very night to those vaults of my family which lie in the catacombs of Ptolemaides.
Though much surprised by the request, and not altogether pleased, I was nevertheless unable to deny him. I could not imagine the purpose of such a visit as the one proposed, but, as was my wont, I forbore to interrogate Tomaron, and merely told him that I would accompany him to the vaults if such were his desire.
I thank you, Theolus, for this proof of friendship, he replied earnestly. Believe me, I am loath to ask it, but there has been a certain deception, an odd misunderstanding which cannot go on any longer. Tonight, you will learn the truth.
Carrying torches, we left the mansion of Tomaron and sought the ancient catacombs of Ptolemaides, which lie beyond the walls and have long been disused, for there is now a fine necropolis in the very heart of the city. The moon had gone down beyond the desert that encroaches toward the catacombs, and we were forced to light our torches long before we came to the subterranean adits. For the rays of Mars and Jupiter in a sodden and funereal sky were not enough to illumine the perilous path we followed among mounds and fallen obelisks and broken graves. At length we discovered the dark and weed-choked entrance of the Carnals, and here Tomaron led the way with a swiftness and surety of footing that bespoke long familiarity with the place. Entering, we found ourselves in a crumbling passage where the bones of dilapidated skeletons were scattered among the rubble that had fallen from the sides and roof. A choking stench of stagnant air and of age-old corruption made me pause for a moment, but Tomaron scarcely appeared to perceive it, for he strode onward, lifting his torch and beckoning me to follow. We traversed many vaults in which mouldy bones and verdigris-eaten sarcophagi were piled about the walls or strewn where desecrating thieves had left them in bygone years. The air was increasingly dank, chill, and miasmal, and mephitic shadows crouched or swayed before our torches in every niche and corner. Also, as we went onward, the walls became more ruinous, and the bones we saw on every hand were greener with the mold of time. At length we rounded a sudden angle of the low cavern we were following. Here we came to vaults that evidently belonged to some noble family, for they were quite spacious, and there was but one sarcophagus in each vault.
My ancestors and my family lie here,
announced Tomaron. We reached the end of the cavern and were confronted by a blank wall. At one side was the final vault, in which an empty sarcophagus stood open. The sarcophagus was wrought of the finest bronze and was richly carven. Tomaron paused before the vault and turned to me. By the flickering, uncertain light, I thought that I saw a look of strange and unaccountable distress on his features.
I must beg you to withdraw for a moment,
he said in a low and sorrowful voice.
Afterwards, you can return.
Surprised and puzzled, I obeyed his request and went slowly back along the passage for some distance. Then I returned to the place where I had left him. My surprise was heightened when I found that he had extinguished his torch and had dropped it on the threshold of the final vault, and Tomaron himself was not visible anywhere. Entering the vault, since there was seemingly no other place where he could have hidden himself, I looked about for him, but the room was empty. At least, I thought it empty, till I looked again at the richly carven sarcophagus and saw that it was now tenanted, for a cadaver lay within, shrouded in a winding sheet of a sort that has not been used for centuries in Ptolemaides. I drew nigh to the sarcophagus, and peering into the face of the cadaver, I saw that it bore a fearful and strange resemblance to the face of Tomeron, though it was bloated and puffed with the adipocere of death, and was purple with the shadows of decay, as after long ages in a carnal air. And looking again, I saw that it was indeed Tomeron. I would have screamed aloud with the horror that came upon me, but my lips were benumbed and frozen, and I could only whisper Tomeron's name. But as I whispered it, the lips of the cadaver seemed to part, and the tip of its tongue protruded between them, and I thought that the tip trembled, as if Tomeron were about to speak and answer me, but gazing more closely, I saw that the trembling was merely the movement of worms as they twisted up and down, and to and fro, and sought to crowd each other from Tomeron's tongue. Ooh. I think it's too late for stories that spoopy, and that one even had a skeleton in it. Hmm? Okay. Let's see. So those were the two that I for sure wanted to do. And we've gained a viewer. We have got 7 people now with us. So let's see. Do you guys want to... Let me find some suitably short ones. Okay. Given the choice, would you prefer to hear from among such tantalizing titles as The Abominations of Yondo, The Ninth Skeleton, or The Last Incantation? Vote in the chat. I'm going to drink some water. It was The Abominations of Yondo, The Ninth Skeleton, and The Last Incantation. Oh, thanks, no person. I'm glad. Honestly, I'm surprised I have even one person listening to this. It would be fun if I was alone, but thought since I'm reading out loud, I might as well do it for an audience. So I really appreciate everybody taking the time to tune in and check out some fun stories. Last Incantation. Okay. Thought for sure someone would have gone with the spoopy skeleton, but tough crowd. Okay, do Last Incantation. 17. The Last Incantation. Malagris the magician sat in the topmost room of his tower, that was builded on a conical hill above the heart of Susran, capital of Poseidon. Oh boy, I should have read this in advance. Poseidonus. Wrought of a dark stone mined from deep in the earth, perdurable and hard as the fabled adamant, this tower loomed above all others, and flung its shadow far on the roofs and domes of the city, even as the sinister power of Malagris had thrown its darkness on the minds of men. Excuse me. Now Malagris was old, and all the baleful might of his enchantments, all the dreadful or curious demons under his control, all the fear that he had wrought in the hearts of kings and prelates, were no longer enough to assuage the black ennui of his days. In his chair that was fashioned from the ivory of mastodons, inset with terrible cryptic runes of red tourmalines and azure crystals, he stared moodily through the one lozenge-shaped window of fulvous glass. His white eyebrows were contracted to a single line on the umber parchment of his face, and beneath them his eyes were cold and green as the ice of ancient flows. His beard, half white, half of a black with glaucous gleams, fell nearly to his knees, and hid many of the writhing serpentine characters inscribed in woven silver athwart the bosom of his violet robe. About him were scattered all the appurtenances of his art, the skulls of men and monsters, phials filled with black or amber liquids, whose sacrilegious use was known to none but himself, little drums of vulture skin, and crotali made from the bones and teeth of the crocodile, used as an accompaniment to certain incantations. The mosaic floor was partly covered with the skins of enormous black and silver apes, and above the door there hung the head of a unicorn in which dwelt the familiar demon of Malagris, in the form of a coral viper with pale green belly and ashen mottlings. Books were piled everywhere, ancient volumes bound in serpent skin, with verdigris-eaten clasps that held the frightful lore of Atlantis, the pentacles that have power upon the demons of the earth and the moon, the spells that transmute or disintegrate the elements, and runes from a lost language of Hyperborea, which, when uttered aloud, were more deadly than poison or more potent than any philter. But though these things and the power they held or symbolized were the terror of the peoples and the envy of all rival magicians, the thoughts of Malagris were dark with immitigable melancholy, and weariness filled his heart as ashes fill the hearth where a great fire has died. Immovable he sat, implacable he mused, while the sun of afternoon, declining on the city and on the sea that was beyond the city, smote with autumnal rays through the window of greenish-yellow glass, and touched his shrunken hands with its phantom gold, and fired the ballast rubies of his rings till they burned like demonian eyes. But in his musings there was neither light nor fire, and turning from the grayness of the present, from the darkness that seemed to close in so imminently upon the future, he groped backward among the shadows of memory, even as a blind man who has lost the sun and seeks it everywhere in vain. And all the vistas of time that had been so full of gold and splendor, the days of triumph that were colored like a searing flame, the crimson and purple of the rich imperial years of his prime, all these were chill and dim and strangely faded now, and the remembrance thereof was no more than the stirring of dead embers. Then Malagris groped backward to the years of his youth, to the misty, remote, incredible years, where, like an alien star, one memory still burned with unfailing luster, the memory of the girl Nilissa, whom he had loved in days ere the lust of unpermitted knowledge and necromantic dominion had ever entered his soul. He had well nigh forgotten her for decades, in the myriad preoccupations of a life so bizarrely diversified, so replete with occult happenings and powers, with supernatural victories and perils. But now, at the mere thought of this slender and innocent child, whom had loved him so dearly when he too was young and slim and guileless, and who had died of a sudden mysterious fever on the very eve of their marriage day, the mummy-like umber of his cheek took on a phantom flush, and deep down in his orbs was a sparkle. It says, his orbs. There's something that's missing. In his orbs was a sparkle like the gleam of mortuary tapers. In his dreams arose the irretrievable suns of youth, and he saw the myrtle-shaded valley of Meros, and the stream Zimander, by whose ever-verdant marge he had walked at eventide with Nilissa, seeing the birth of summer stars in the heavens, the stream, and the eyes of his beloved. Now, addressing the demonian viper that dwelt in the head of the unicorn, Malagris spoke with the low, monotonous intonation of one who thinks aloud. Viper, in the years before you came to dwell with me and to make your abode in the head of the unicorn, I knew a girl who was lovely and frail as the orchids of the jungle, and who died as the orchids die. Viper, am I not Malagris, in whom is centered the mastery of all occult lore, all forbidden diminations, with dominion over the spirits of earth and sea and air, over the solar and lunar demons, over the living and the dead? If so I desire, can I not call the girl Nilissa, in the very semblance of all her youth and beauty, and bring her forth from the never-changing shadows of the cryptic tomb, to stand before me in this chamber, in the evening rays of this autumnal sun? Yes, master, replied the viper in a low but singularly penetrating hiss. You are Malagris, and all sorceress or necromantic power is yours. All incantations and spells and pentacles are known to you. It is possible, if you so desire, to summon the girl Nilissa from her abode among the dead, and to behold her again as she was ere her loveliness had known the ravening kiss of the worm. Viper, is it well, is it meet, that I should summon her thus? Will there be nothing to lose and nothing to regret? The viper seemed to hesitate. Then in a more slow and measured hiss, It is meet for Malagris to do as he would. Who, save Malagris, can decide if a thing be well or ill? In other words, you will not advise me? The query was as much a statement as a question, and the viper vouchsafed no further utterance. Malagris brooded for a while, with his chin on his knotted hands. Then he arose with a long unwonted celerity and sureness of movement that belied his wrinkles, and gathered together from different coigns of the chamber, from ebony shelves, from caskets with locks of gold or brass or electrum, the sundry appurtenances that were needful for his magic. He drew on the floor the requisite circles, and standing within the centermost he lit the thuribles that contained the prescribed incense, and read aloud from a long narrow scroll of grey vellum the purple and vermilion runes of the ritual that summons the departed. The fumes of the censers, blue and white and violet, arose in thick clouds and speedily filled the room with ever-writhing interchanging columns, among which the sunlight disappeared and was succeeded by a wan, unearthly glow, pale as the light of moons that ascend from leave. With preternatural slowness, with unhuman solemnity, the voice of the necromancer went on in a priest-like chant till the scroll was ended, and the last echoes lessened and died out in hollow sepulchral vibrations. Then the colored vapors cleared away, as if the folds of a curtain had been drawn back. But the pale, unearthly glow still filled the chamber, and between Malagris and the door where hung the unicorn's head there stood the apparition of Nelissa, even as she had stood in the perished years, bending a little like a wind-blown flower, and smiling with the unmindful poignancy of youth. Fragile, pallid, and simply gowned, with anemone blossoms in her black hair, with eyes that held the new-born azure of vernal heavens, she was all that Malagris had remembered, and his sluggish heart was quickened with an old delightful fever as he looked upon her. "Are you Nelissa?" he asked. "The Nelissa whom I had loved in the myrtle-shaded valley of Meros, in the golden-hearted days that have gone with all dead eons to the timeless gulf?" "Yes, I am Nelissa." Her voice was the simple and rippling silver of the voice that had echoed so long in his memory. But somehow, as he gazed and listened, there grew a tiny doubt. A doubt no less absurd than intolerable, but nevertheless insistent. Was this altogether the same Nelissa he had known? Was there not some elusive change, too subtle to be named or defined? Had time and the grave not taken something away? An innominable something that his magic had not wholly restored? Were the eyes as tender? Was the black hair as lustrous? The form as slim and supple as those of the girl he recalled? He could not be sure, and the growing doubt was succeeded by a leaden dismay, by a grim despondency that choked his heart as with ashes. His scrutiny became searching and exigent and cruel, and momently the phantom was less and less the perfect semblance of Nelissa. Momently the lips and brow were less lovely, less subtle in their curves. The slender figure became thin, the tresses took on a common black, and the neck an ordinary pallor. The soul of Malagris grew sick again with age and despair and the death of his evanescent hope. He could believe no longer in youth or age, or in love or youth or beauty, and even the memory of these things was a dubitable mirage, a thing that might or might not have been. There was nothing left but shadow and grayness and dust, nothing but the empty dark and the cold, and a clutching weight of insufferable weariness, of immedicable anguish. In accents that were thin and quavering like the ghost of his former voice, he pronounced the incantation that serves to dismiss a summoned phantom. The form of Nelissa melted upon the air like smoke, and the lunar gleam that had surrounded her was replaced by the last rays of the sun. Malagris turned to the viper and spoke in a tone of melancholy reproof. "Why did you not warn me?" "Would the warning have availed?" was the counter-question. "All knowledge was yours, Malagris, excepting this one thing, and in no other way could you have learned it." "What thing?" queried the magician. "I've learned nothing, except the vanity of wisdom, the impotence of magic, the nullity of love, and the delusiveness of memory. Tell me, why could I not recall to life the same Nelissa whom I knew or thought I knew?" "It was indeed Nelissa whom you summoned and saw," replied the Viper.
Your necromancy was potent up to this point, but no necromantic spell could recall for you your own lost youth, or the fervent and guileless heart that loved Nelissa, or the ardent eyes that beheld her then. This, my master, was the thing that you had to learn.
That's it. I think that's probably pretty good. 3 stories for tonight. I don't know how frequently we'll do this or how often. I would say I'd like to do it once a week, but my availability is kind of here and there these days. So thank you again for joining.